The year was 1893. On the banks of the Mekong, cannons thundered as the French gunboats forced their way toward Siam's capital. Behind the smoke and fire lay not just a battle, but the reshaping of Southeast Asia itself. Cambodia, long caught in the jaws of its powerful neighbors, once again became a pawn in a greater game, this time between Siam and France. For centuries, Siam had occupied Cambodia's lands, extracting tribute and asserting dominance. But now, Europe's colonial tide had arrived, determined to redraw maps and rewrite destinies. The Franco-Siamese War would not be a long one, but its impact would echo for generations. Siam would lose Laos, retreat from Cambodian territory, and see its ambitions crushed under the weight of empire. This is the story of how the Mekong became a frontier of survival, and how Cambodia's fate was decided not by its own will, but by the clash of others. Part 1: The Sparks on the Mekong. The year was 1893, and the waters of the Mekong River carried more than just trade and fishing boats. They carried suspicion, ambition, and the growing shadows of empire. This was the age of high colonialism, when the Western powers carved up entire continents with penstrokes on maps and with cannon fire on the ground. For Siam, the kingdom that had long balanced precariously between empires, the Mekong was no longer just a river. It had become the fault line of survival. The Franco-Siamese War did not emerge out of nowhere. Its roots lay in decades of competition over Indochina, in the ambitions of France to dominate Southeast Asia, and in Siam's struggle to hold on to territories it claimed as its tributary domains. And in between stood Laos and Cambodia, kingdoms that had once flourished under their own sovereignty, but had become pawns in the deadly game between Siam and France. To understand the sparks that ignited the conflict, one must begin by seeing Siam not as a timeless state, but as an empire in decline. An empire that clung to its outer provinces in the hope that they might serve as a shield against Western intrusion. Yet these provinces, Cambodia, Laos, parts of the Shan and Malay states, were not all willing participants in Siamese control. Many of them remembered their own histories, their own kings, their own capitals. When Siam expanded its authority into Laos and Cambodia during the 18th and 19th centuries, it did so often through conquest, deportation, and forced tribute. The Khmer, once masters of Angkor, had long been reduced to vassals caught between Vietnam and Siam. The Lao heirs to the Lan Xang kingdom were split into smaller polities, their rulers hostage to Bangkok's demands. For Siam, these lands were buffers. For their peoples, they were cages. By the mid-19th century, however, a new power had arrived. France, through its conquest of Cochin China in the 1860s, the establishment of protectorates over Cambodia in 1863, and its expansion into Annam and Tonkin in the 1880s, France was steadily creating what it would later call French Indochina. To the French, Siam's claims over Laos and parts of Cambodia were illegitimate, nothing more than the hold of a declining Asian empire over peoples who in French eyes deserved to be protected by the modern civilization of Europe. But this protection was less about ideals and more about empire. The Mekong River had become the focus of French dreams. They believed it could serve as a great artery of trade, connecting their colony of Indochina to the riches of China's Yunnan province. To control the Mekong, however, France needed to secure both banks, and that meant confronting Siam. The sparks began in the borderlands. In the 1880s, French explorers and officials began pushing further into Lao territories. They mapped the river, built posts, and pressed their claims. Siam responded by tightening its control, sending officials and troops to assert sovereignty. This clash of ambitions quickly turned violent. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, several incidents occurred where Siamese officials resisted French encroachment. In Kaimuan and Champozek, Siamese garrisons confronted French survey teams on the eastern banks of the Mekong, where Lao villagers owed tribute to Siam but lay within France's growing zone of influence. Tensions escalated into skirmishes. The French, eager to prove Siam's supposed brutality, exaggerated accounts of mistreatment, presenting Bangkok as a barbaric oppressor that had to be restrained by European civilization. At the same time, Cambodia remained a festering wound. Ever since 1867, when Siam had been forced by treaty to recognize Cambodia as under French protectorate, while retaining Battambang and Siem Reap, France had sought to weaken Siam's remaining grip. The French viewed Siam's presence in Western Cambodia as an obstacle to their authority. To them, Cambodia should be whole under the tricolor flag, not divided between two masters. Every French move in Cambodia and Laos thus struck at the heart of Siamese fears. The kingdom was still haunted by the memory of Britain's looming power in Burma and Malaya, and it knew all too well that it could not fight the Western powers on equal terms. But pride, history, and survival pushed Siam to hold on. If it yielded too easily, it risked unraveling entirely. King Chulalongkorn Ramavi understood this well. His reign was defined by the struggle to modernize Siam, to reform its military, its administration, and its diplomacy in order to stand against the storm of colonialism. He sent princes to study in Europe, hired foreign advisors, and sought treaties with both Britain and France to maintain Siam's independence. But modernization could not erase geopolitics. To France, Siam was not a modernizing ally but an obstacle, standing between Indochina and further dreams of empire. By 1892, tensions reached the boiling point. French officials in Indochina accused Siamese soldiers of abusing Lao villagers who had accepted French protection. They claimed that Siam's forts on the east bank of the Mekong were illegal, that the river belonged to Laos, now under French authority. Siam, in turn, accused the French of violating its sovereignty, of sending gunboats and troops across borders without consent. The conflict hardened into a question of prestige. Neither side could back down without humiliation. The Mekong River, once a lifeline of trade and culture, now became the frontier of imperial confrontation. The situation was worsened by the arrogance of colonial officers on the ground. French commanders in Indochina acted with little patience, driven by ambition and convinced of their superiority over the Asiatic kingdom. Siamese officials, proud and unwilling to bow, responded with defiance. Skirmishes turned into open clashes. By early 1893, French expeditions were being ambushed. Siamese forts were firing on patrols, and both sides were preparing for something greater. For France, the opportunity was clear. With Britain watching from the west, Paris saw in Siam a chance to expand without provoking its great European rival, at least for now. By forcing Siam to retreat from Laos, France could secure the Mekong and claim victory in the name of empire. For Siam, however, the crisis was existential. To lose Laos was not just to lose territory. It was to admit weakness, to invite further demands, and perhaps to see the kingdom carved up like Burma, Vietnam, or Africa. Chulalongkorn and his ministers knew they were cornered, but they also knew they had to resist at least until the balance of power forced their hand. And so, in the summer of 1893, sparks became fire. French gunboats began moving aggressively along the river. Reports of clashes filtered back to Paris, where the colonial lobbied. Part 2. Gunboats and Ultimatums. The Franco-Siamese War of 1893 did not erupt suddenly. It was the culmination of decades of mounting tension, French colonial ambition, and Siam's stubborn refusal to cede authority over its tributary states. Yet the breaking point, the moment that seared itself into the memory of both French and Siamese chronicles, came not through battlefield clashes in the jungles of Laos or Cambodia, but on the waters of the Chao Phraya River. This was the age of gunboat diplomacy, and in July 1893, French ironclads transformed the Mekong frontier dispute into an existential crisis for Siam. The roots of this confrontation were already visible in Part 1, when French colonial administrators in Indochina pressed ever harder to expand their territorial control across the Mekong. Laos, in French eyes, was a natural extension of their domain in Annam and Tonkin. Siam, however, still clung tightly to its centuries-old claims, ruling through vassal princes and military outposts. For Siam's rulers, losing Laos would mean losing not only land, but prestige, the ability to command loyalty from its frontier dependencies, and the illusion of parity with Western powers. Yet the clash of these incompatible ambitions would soon turn deadly. By the early months of 1893, skirmishes escalated into outright fighting along the left bank of the Mekong. French expeditions moved into the disputed zones, while Siamese garrisons resisted with varying degrees of ferocity. The most infamous incident occurred at Kamuan and later near Chang Island, where French forces were ambushed and several officers killed. To Paris and Hanoi, this was framed as a deliberate provocation by Siam, proof that the kingdom was obstructing civilized order along the Mekong. To Bangkok, however, the narrative was the reverse. French intrusions had crossed long-recognized boundaries, and Siamese defenders had merely upheld sovereignty against foreign invaders. The deaths of French officers provided the perfect pretext for escalation. The colonial government in Cochin China, eager to humiliate Siam and expand France's Indo-Chinese domain, demanded reparations and territorial concessions. The French envoy in Bangkok pressed harder, while warships were readied along the coast of Vietnam. Siam sent desperate pleas to Britain, hoping the great empire would restrain France, but London had no appetite for direct confrontation. British policymakers valued stability in Siam as a buffer, but they were unwilling to intervene militarily on its behalf. Siam's diplomacy was running out of options. Then came the move that would burn itself into the chronicles of Southeast Asia, the French decision to send gunboats directly up the Chao Phraya River, straight toward Bangkok itself. This was not merely a show of force. It was a deliberate act of intimidation designed to bring the Siamese court to its knees. The episode became known as the Paknam Incident. On July 13, 1893, two French gunboats, the Inconstant, escorted by a third ship, steamed into the Gulf of Siam and made for the river mouth at Paknam. The Siamese, aware of the violation, had prepared shore batteries and war junks to block their passage. The stage was set for confrontation. As the French ships pressed forward, Siamese defenses opened fire. What followed was a short but violent exchange. Despite being outnumbered, the French warships, modern and heavily armed, returned fire with devastating accuracy. The Siamese junks were shattered, river batteries silenced, and within hours the French vessels forced their way through the defenses, steaming upriver toward the heart of Siam's capital. The message was clear: Siam was helpless before French firepower. The humiliation was not only military but psychological. Bangkok's royal court, the palace walls trembling from the distant roar of French cannon, could see firsthand the imbalance of power between traditional Asian states and industrial Western empires. The sight of French ironclads anchoring near Bangkok was an unmistakable ultimatum: comply with French demands or risk bombardment of the capital itself. This show of naval strength was accompanied by formal diplomatic ultimatums. France demanded immediate acceptance of its claims over Laos, the payment of indemnities for the deaths of its officers, and the withdrawal of Siamese forces from disputed territories. Moreover, a blockade of the Siamese coast was imposed, cutting off trade and threatening famine in the capital. For Siam, a trading kingdom dependent on rice exports and imports of modern goods, the blockade was crippling. Within days, supplies tightened, prices soared, and panic spread among Bangkok's merchants and common people. At the palace, King Chulalongkorn Rama V faced a nightmare. He and his ministers knew Siam could not match French power in open battle. The memory of British Burma's annihilation of the Burmese monarchy in the 1880s haunted their thoughts. The fate of Mandalay, its king deposed and its lands annexed, was a living warning. Resist afar and Siam itself might vanish. Yet to submit without protest would damage royal prestige and embolden French colonial ambitions further. Every decision carried risks, and the clock ticked as French gunboats held Bangkok hostage. Britain's role in this crisis was ambivalent. While London had no desire to see France dominate Siam completely, its support was deliberately lukewarm. The British consulate advised Siam to comply with French demands for the sake of survival, while quietly reassuring Paris that Britain would not intervene. For Siam, this was betrayal cloaked in diplomacy. The very empire it had looked to as a protector was content to watch from the sidelines as French power grew. The ultimatum issued by France in late July 1893 was brutal in its clarity. Siam must recognize the Mekong River as the boundary of French Indochina, ceding all territory on the left bank to French control. Furthermore, a demilitarized zone on the right bank would be established, stripping Siam of defensive positions. A heavy indemnity must be paid, and apologies issued for the so-called aggressions against French officers. Siam had 48 hours to comply or face bombardment and invasion. The Council of Ministers, under immense strain, deliberated feverishly. Some military officials argued for resistance, invoking honor and the need to defend sovereignty at all costs. But pragmatists, led by King Chulalongkorn, urged submission, reasoning that survival of the kingdom was more important than the defense of distant provinces. Chulalongkorn, a monarch deeply aware of the technological gap between Siam and Europe, understood that a reckless war would only lead to Siam's destruction. It was better, he reasoned, to yield territory and bide time than to risk the collapse of the dynasty itself. On July 29, 1893, Siam formally accepted the French ultimatum. The concessions were sweeping. Laos was lost. The Mekong became the new frontier, and French prestige surged across Indochina. For Siam, the humiliation was searing, a wound that would fester in its national memory. The phrase "gunboats and ultimatums" was not merely a description of tactics, but a shorthand for the painful lesson that Siam's sovereignty survived only by careful compromise with imperial power. Yet even in defeat, Siamese resilience was evident. Unlike Burma or Vietnam, Siam remained independent, its monarchy intact, its capital unoccupied. Chulalongkorn's gamble to yield when necessary preserved the state, allowing for later reforms and modernization that would help Siam resist full colonization. Still, the cost of survival was immense. A vast stretch of territory, once claimed as part of the kingdom's domain, was surrendered to French Indochina, and Siam's diplomatic credibility was shattered. The French, for their part, celebrated victory but also revealed their colonial ruthlessness. The war, brief and one-sided, demonstrated that European empires had little hesitation in using overwhelming force to impose their will on weaker states. The image of French gunboats at Paknam entered Southeast Asian memory as a symbol of coercion, of treaties written under the shadow of cannons. For Cambodia and Laos, the consequences were profound. The territories stripped from Siam were absorbed into French Indochina, shifting the map of the region permanently. Laos, long caught between Siamese and Vietnamese spheres of influence, now became a French colony, its fate tied to Hanoi and Saigon rather than Bangkok. Cambodia, already under French protectorate since 1863, saw Siam's retreat from its contested frontiers, consolidating French authority even further. Thus Part 2 ends on a note of crisis and reluctant submission. Gunboats had spoken louder than diplomacy, ultimatums had carved new borders, and Siam's leaders had chosen survival over resistance. Part 3, the price of retreat. The summer of 1893 had changed everything. What began as diplomatic tension, as territorial debates wrapped in the folds of maps and treaties, had erupted into confrontation between Siam and France. By the time the French gunboats anchored menacingly in the Chao Phraya River at Bangkok, Siam's illusion of defiance collapsed. The crisis that had burned on the Mekong front was now forced to a humiliating conclusion in the very heart of Siam's capital. For Siam, the events of July 1893 were not merely a political setback. They were a humiliation carved into the memory of the nation. And for Cambodia, long shackled under Siamese dominance, it marked another stage in the painful reshaping of its borders. Caught between two powers, one retreating, the other advancing. To understand the full price of retreat, one must return to the war itself. French colonial ambitions in Indochina were not subtle. By the late 1880s, the French had consolidated control over southern Vietnam, Cochin China, annexed Cambodia as a protectorate in 1863, and forced treaties with the Nguyen dynasty in Hue. Yet to the west, Siam still clung tightly to its historic claims over Laos and parts of Cambodia, citing centuries of tributary relations. Siamese officials claimed rights of suzerainty over Lao, principalities east of the Mekong and Cambodian provinces, stretching as far as Stung Treng. These claims were not idle words. They were a matter of prestige, a badge of dominance that Siam had worn since the days of Ayutthaya. But the French viewed them as illegitimate encroachments upon lands they now deemed theirs. When French explorers and administrators crossed the Mekong into Lao territory in the 1880s, clashes became inevitable. In 1893, the crisis boiled over when Siamese and French patrols engaged in skirmishes along the river. The French accused Siam of detaining their officers, harassing Cambodian villagers under French protection, and refusing to recognize the Mekong as the eastern boundary of Siam's influence. The Siamese, in turn, accused France of exaggerating minor incidents as a pretext for expansion. But France had a weapon Siam could not match: gunboats. The so-called Paknam incident in July 1893 was the decisive moment. On July 13th, French gunboats, the Comet and the Inconstant, forced their way past Siamese defenses at the mouth of the Chao Phraya River. Siamese artillery fired, but the French ships, modern and armored, pressed through, inflicting casualties and reaching the outskirts of Bangkok. Their presence was a silent ultimatum. Siam must yield or suffer bombardment of its capital. Under the looming shadow of foreign firepower, Siam had no choice but to submit. The Franco-Siamese Treaty, signed on October 3, 1893, imposed brutal terms. Siam was forced to relinquish all territories east of the Mekong River, essentially all of modern Laos to French Indochina. The treaty also created a 25-kilometer demilitarized zone on the Siamese side of the Mekong, where Siam was forbidden to station troops. To enforce compliance, French troops occupied Chanthaburi on Siam's coast. For a kingdom that prided itself on never being colonized, the treaty was nothing short of a humiliation. For France, it was a triumph, extending their Indo-Chinese empire and securing control over both banks of the Mekong. But for Cambodia, the price of Siam's retreat was more complicated. Cambodia had lived under centuries of Siamese interference, its kings reduced to pawns, its provinces divided between Siam and Vietnam. The French protectorate of 1863 had promised salvation, but in practice, Cambodia remained a chessboard in the rivalry between Siam and France. When Siam surrendered Laos in 1893, Cambodia's territorial integrity was indirectly affected. The French claim now extended firmly to Cambodian lands that Siam once sought to dominate. Provinces like Stung Treng, long contested, now shifted decisively into the French Indochinese orbit. Cambodia's borders were redrawn not by Cambodian hands, but by negotiations between Siam and France. The humiliation did not end with the signing of the treaty. Siamese elites, especially King Chulalongkorn Rama V, struggled to maintain dignity in the face of foreign domination. Chulalongkorn's modernization program had been designed precisely to prevent such an outcome. Schools, railroads, a modern bureaucracy, and new army were meant to prove that Siam was civilized enough to resist colonization. Yet, modernization could not outpace the cold reality of gunboat diplomacy. Siam's leaders found themselves trapped in a paradox. To preserve independence, they were forced to surrender territory piece by piece, each retreat buying survival at the cost of humiliation. The Cambodian people watched as their fate was determined in distant capitals. To the ordinary Khmer farmer, living along the Mekong or tending rice fields near Battambang, these treaties were invisible documents, yet their effects were profound. Families who had lived for generations under Siamese tax collectors now found themselves subjects of France. The identity of their rulers changed with the stroke of a pen in Paris or Bangkok, but their voices were never asked, their lives never consulted. Cambodia's survival came at the cost of fragmentation, lands lost to Siam in the west, lands conceded to France in the east. The Khmer nation, once stretching proudly across the Mekong basin, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Strangled between two rival powers, the French celebrated their victory with grandeur. Newspapers in Paris heralded the expansion of the Republic's civilizing mission, boasting that France had humbled a once defiant Siam. Diplomats framed it as a triumph of law and order, presenting the treaty as a rational settlement of disputes. But beneath the polished rhetoric lay naked imperialism. France had wielded the threat of bombardment to extract concessions. This was not diplomacy, it was coercion. And Siam, though it remained independent in name, had been forced into the humiliating role of a defeated state. For Siam, the memory of 1893 festered. It marked the beginning of a series of unequal treaties and concessions to colonial powers, though Siam would later recover some dignity, negotiating the return of Chanthaburi in 1904 and trading Battambang and Siem Reap to France in 1907. The scar of 1893 never healed. Nationalist historians in Thailand would later frame it as an era of humiliation, a time when Western imperialists forced Siam to its knees. But often forgotten in that narrative is the Cambodian perspective, the reality that Cambodia had been the perpetual victim, caught between Siamese expansionism and French colonial ambitions. In the long arc of history, the Franco-Siamese War of 1893 was brief, almost bloodless compared to other wars, yet its consequences were immense. The Mekong was cemented as the boundary between Siam and French Indochina. Cambodia's borders became further entangled in the shadow of great powers, and Siam, though it survived as a kingdom, had to accept the bitter truth. It could not defy Europe's empires without paying the price. The human cost of these shifting boundaries is harder to measure, but it is no less real. Families divided by the new border suddenly found themselves under different flags. Traders who once moved freely across the Mekong now faced restrictions, taxes, and the threat of foreign soldiers. Lao and Khmer, communities east of the river, were redefined as French subjects, their traditions recast within the bureaucratic framework of Indochina. The retreat of Siam was, in reality, the expansion of colonial power and the tightening of a noose around the autonomy of Southeast Asia as smaller nations. As we step back and view this history in its full light, we see the shadows it cast into the present. The territorial losses of 1893 still echo in Thai politics, where nationalist rhetoric often invokes lost territories as a wound to national pride. For Cambodia, the legacy is one of survival amidst subjugation, the endurance of a people whose land was treated as spoils in the games of stronger powers. And for France, it marked another triumph in its colonial saga, though one that sowed seeds of resistance that would later grow into anti-colonial movements. The Franco-Siamese War of 1893 was not merely about lines on a map. It was about humiliation and survival, about the crushing weight of imperial power, and about the silence of those who suffered most, the Cambodian people, trapped in the struggle of giants. Siam retreated, France advanced, and Cambodia endured. The price of retreat was not only territory, but dignity, sovereignty, and the dreams of a region whose future was stolen by the iron will of empires. And so, as the dust settled on the banks of the Mekong, the kingdoms of Southeast Asia entered a new chapter, one where the struggle for survival would continue, and where the scars of 1893 would remind them that freedom was fragile, and that the price of retreat could last for generations. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.